And we're back. Welcome to Module 3, where we'll be talking about Node.js and Express, which is the E and the N. Mean is not in the order what it should be. I don't know why, but it sounds better that way. So we're going to be talking about Express and Node.js today. And I guess to get started, we'll dive right into what Node is, and then kind of a bit about what Express is, and we'll start implementing those backend APIs that the Angular application is going to expect from us when it starts running. So really, we'll start with why use Node, the NPM Node Package Manager, understanding Express, and routing. So why should you use Node? Well, it runs on JavaScript. It's based on the same runtime that's in the JavaScript runtime that's in the Chrome browser. So it's a mature runtime that's sitting underneath it. It's completely single-threaded, and which means that it's actually pretty fast at optimizing for input-output. So things like a web server where it really does handle a ton of requests, it can serve those requests and continue to the next one very fast. So you can get started. It's really easy, actually. If you want to create a simple HTTP server, so assuming that you have Node.js installed, I could just actually copy this. It's actually really easy. And what I'll do is I'll just copy it into Interactive Console, and that should just allow us to run a quick, easy web server. So I'm going to switch over to, let me open up a new window. OK. So I'm going to do Node, and it should take me to Interactive Console. I think if I paste everything in here, cool. So what happened was I just copied exactly what was on the PowerPoint, which is really just creating a HTTP server, so requiring the HTTP module. Requiring Node.js just means, hey, I want to grab this module. Afterwards, we're going to call the create server function on it. And really what it's just going to do is just going to write back with a plain text content type header, hello world. And it'll just listen on localhost 1337, and it should just tell us hello world. So if I go to localhost 1337, hello world. Pretty simple, and that was really fast. So all of a sudden, we created a web server in about like 8 lines of code. So that's why Node is awesome. Cool. So I'll kill this server so it's not running on my computer anymore. And so we'll continue. Now, Express is actually a routing framework that sits on top of Node.js. And so if you remembered from the previous example, actually, we had this right here, write head, content type header, all this like low-level stuff, which is really just the headers for HTTP messages. Instead, it actually just handles that for you, and it makes those APIs a lot nicer and allows us to create this thing called routing, which is essentially routes, paths into your server, which allows us to interact with those requests. We can interact with the requests much easier by serializing to JSON and XML quite easily. We don't really have to worry too much about headers unless we want to change something. And the really cool thing that I personally like about Express is that it's minimalistic, it's fast, and it's unopinionated. And what I mean by unopinionated is that it doesn't really have baked in MVC frameworks or baked in anything really. It's just a routing layer, and you can pick those frameworks and those things, and you can put it on top of it, and you take those pieces. It allows you to stay more agile, and you can update pieces faster rather than having one large framework altogether. But that's my personal preference, and that's why I like it. So to get started, it's actually really easy to create Express application. The first thing we'll do is, so this command here says Express, but actually, so I'm going to go right into demo. We actually need to install the Express generator. And so this window is just all screwy, so I'm going to use this one. And if I go back to my GitHub repository, so if I users, Edward, actually, I need the documents folder here. Grab this. So this is the GitHub repository. I'm in module 3. I'm going to create a new folder called start. It's right next to finish. Finish has what we'll end up with. And we'll CD right into that. Hoping that path isn't too long for Node. We'll see. OK, so what we first need to do is we need to do node npm install. And so npm is our package manager for Node.js. And the reason why I have to talk about this really quick is because we need to install the Express generator. and we'll use -G to say that we want it installed globally. If you're using this on, I know particularly on OS X, if you're on Linux, sometimes you might have to use a sudo command to get this to work. You might hit a permission failed. And so now we have the Express generator, CLI, installed. So now we can just do Express, and the command is Express --EJS, which just means that we want to use the EJS rendering engine, and the directory name. So EJS, and we'll just hit period because we want it here. And what this will do is it'll create a basic bare bones Express application. And in order for us to actually get things going, we have to install all the dependencies that we need. So we'll just do npm install. And npm install will actually install everything. And I'll...
How do you know what dependencies you need?
I was about to just go say it. So if we go to Notepad and go to package.json. Ooh, this is not formatted very nicely. So package.json is a JSON file which has metadata about our application. So the name of the application, it just defaults to what the name of the directory was. So it's start. It's a private app. This is metadata for the Node package manager. But the most important thing is the dependencies here. So these dependencies tell us which packages. It's really just a manifest of the packages required to get this app going. So we need body parser, cookie parser, all this other stuff, Express, to actually get things going. So that's how we know. And so now we've created our Express application. I'm going to go ahead and open this with Sublime so I could have a nice look at the folder. So we have app.js, and then inside that we have our roots. So let me see. I'm going to pop back to my PowerPoint to keep myself on track. So I talked about npm lightly. It's a command line package manager for useful libraries on Node.js. Some people also actually use it for front-end frameworks too. You can also use npm for browser frameworks as well. It's akin to pip or Python, pip for Python or gem for Ruby, and it comes bundled with the Node.js installation. So unlike pip, where I think in Python 2.7 or something, it doesn't actually come with it, this actually comes bundled together. So if you install Node.js, you actually get npm as well. Package.json is a manifest for all the required packages that you actually need. It tells the system what libraries you need to actually run your code, and npm interacts with package.json very frequently. So we specify the developer dependencies as well as the production dependencies. That's a little bit more advanced, so we won't talk about that today. And as well as the CI test. Generally, when you do things like Travis CI, Visual Studio Online, things like that, they'll look for npm start or npm test as the entry point for running your test. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start with routing, and I'm going to start with so the routing and Express allows us to create these paths into our server, such as whack auth, whack login. And so this is actually not the actual URL of the application. I believe it's chirp-MVA. Chirp-MVA, yeah. But it does a path to our server, and that's what the routes do. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to actually jump into some live coding here. So we have our basic boilerplate app.js. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove these two directories here, just because, or these two files, index.js and user.js. It's just something that Express puts in there as by default. I'll go ahead and actually just copy it, just because it's useful for us to know what those things are, or to have. We'll use in a second. We're going to remove the references here. So in Node.js, when you want to pull in reference to another JavaScript file called modules, we have to use the require statement. It's actually require JS. You can read more about it. But it actually imports our files. So instead of using routes and index and users, we're going to create two new files here. We're going to call one api.js, and we're going to call the other authenticate.js. Cool. So now we have api.js and authenticate.js. They're empty right now. But what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and change this to API and API. I'm going to comment this one out, but I'm going to keep it. I'm going to go ahead and change it for authenticate, because we're going to do the API first, and then we'll do the authentication APIs. So authenticate. See if I
You
can
got it.
spell.
Yep.
Boom. Okay. And instead of routes, we'll use users will use authenticate, and then that'll pull that in. Finally, Express has these .uses here, and so it's used for a couple things. It's used for setting which routers we'll use, and we'll talk about routers in a second. And it also talks about also uses our for middleware, and I'll also talk about middleware in a bit. But most importantly is that we need to change our routers that we're going to use. So API and Authenticate will be an Express router, and instead of just using the baked-in default ones, we're actually going to use the ones that we've defined. So for any path that starts with API that comes from our local host or whatever the name of the server, the host name is /API, we're going to we're going to assign that to the API router, and any route that starts with authenticate or auth, we'll just use auth for short, we'll point that to the authenticate router. It's pulling up all the Angular stuff. Yeah.
Do you want to comment out the authenticate?
Yep. Thank you, because that will crash if we do that. Okay, cool. So now we actually pulled those in. Now, if you remember, I did copy and paste some boilerplate code. Oh, I lost it. Oh, well. So if I actually go into the README, which is just guides you through exactly everything I'm doing right now, we will have some boilerplate code here, which is, okay, right here. So what this does really is it pulls in the Express module. It says, hey, here's the Express router. And what it's going to do is we're going to do some stuff, and then eventually we're going to export this module as a router so it can be used by the app.js. Okay, so in the some implementation part, we're actually going to start doing some routing. So we could do like router.route, and we can pick the API that we want to do. So we are on API, so we want post. And so post will be the cheaps that we have. We'll call those post. And really kind of the way it works is like it's seen as kind of like a resource. So we'll have, for this API, we'll assume that we'll have a get and we'll have a post. A get will return all of our posts, and a post request from the client will create a new post. So we can do router.route post, and then we could say get. And so this will return all post. So it returns all the posts that we need for the that's in the database. But currently we don't have a database. So what we're going to do is we're just going to add the function, the request handler. Request handlers in Express take two functions, rec and res. And basically that means that, hey, we have a request object, which comes from the client, and a response object, which comes from the server. And we request the object, or the request object has all the things that the client asks for, and the response object has what you respond with. And in our case, because temporary solution, we don't really have our MongoDB server set up yet. So what we'll do is we'll just respond with a OK, and we'll just say, hey, to do, we got to do this. So we could do res.send, and I believe I could just put like message here. I could say to do. Return all post. Okay. And so that's for the get function, or the get. The .get will give us the get method. We also want the .post because we want to be able to do the get endpoint and the post endpoint. And the post will do the same thing. We'll use the request handler function signature, which is rec res. And so we'll just say, we won't really pay attention to what the request does. We'll just do, again, a temporary solution. And it'll just be to do to say, hey, in this case, though, instead of returning all post, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new post. And I'll say to do. Post. OK. And now, I can just put the semicolon since I finished the whole line. And what we'll do now is we'll just export router because I've added the routes to the route. And because of that, in app.js, when we do the require on API, it'll be seen as a router. And app.use expects a router to be registered with Express. I want to make sure I didn't go too far here. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and just try this out. So one thing I use to test a lot on for web applications, and I don't think I can use incognito. I think I have to use a regular one. If I do Chrome apps, so if you go into Chrome Store, there's two cool applications you could use just to test apps, and actually the one I like is installed. There's Postman, which is a REST client here. Oh, I was expecting zoom it. There we go. I'm going to quickly install Advanced REST Client because I prefer to use that because I'm just more familiar with it. But basically, it's just a client that will allow us to test our web APIs without actually having to write some code to actually use it.
So you're going to use this to create to basically make some GET and POST requests?
Yep, exactly. So let me see if I can zoom that in. And I can't actually do it without running the server. So if I do ls to show you I'm right here, and if I didn't screw anything up, if I do npm start, we should be able to start the application. It starts at bin www, which is the starting script. And so if I go to back to Advanced REST Client, I say localhost 3000 API post. If I do a get, I should get a response. It says, hey, return all post.
So that's interesting. Is it that whenever you make an API router, then all of the methods below it will be for auth? We'll have the API.
So because I put this stuff in API, and this starts at post, so this is defined the post, but you can notice that there's no API here. If you go back to app.js, which is responsible for registering all of our routers, we noticed that we mounted the API router to the API path, which means that every route that's defined API will start with WAG API.
Okay.
So that's how that works. So cool. So if I do a post here, it'll say, hey, to do create a new post. So we know that we have that. And if we did a put or something else, we would expect to have a 404 not found. My mouse is crazy. There we go. If I do post here, 404 not found, because we didn't define that API, which is how we expect to answer. OK, so let's get more fancy. Let's do some more stuff here. The last thing we want to do is, Helen's going to talk about what resources are in Angular. But Angular actually kind of imposes one little thing on our server, and it basically says that if you're going to define something as what's called a resource, it needs to have a certain type of conformity on its REST API, which means that we want to be able to manipulate a collection of resources as well as individual resources. So because of that, we should also make another route that is specific for a certain post. So Express actually has this really cool syntax here where you can just put a :id, which will automatically parse the path and pass this ID as the parameter. So if I I'll actually just show you what I mean, because it's way easier just to show you than to explain it. So I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to do get, and this will return a particular post. OK. And so get, we'll do post. Sorry, not post. Function rec res. So it's the same type of response handler that we had done from before. And so we have get function rec res, and what we'll do is we'll just say res.send message to do return post with ID, and I'll add the request.params.id. So what this does, it basically, this params object will parse out what this ID thing was and pass it as a variable ID. And then we have, so what we'll see is actually what we passed in the path. Now, what's cool about this is that by doing this, we've actually effectively created an infinite number of routes, because ID could be anything. So you could do WAC API, WAC post, WAC 1234, 1238, 123, whatever the name of the path is, which is really neat because it kind of expands and makes your API flexible. So if you've seen on websites before, you might have like Facebook or whatever, it's like whack post, whack add new comment. That's what they're doing. They're basically, those aren't actually hard coded. They just have a variable and the server knows what to do with that part of the URL.
Yeah.
So if I do a put here, so what we want to do for a put request, we'll say modifies or updates. So it's kind of like CRUD, basically, if you're familiar with databases, but just update existing post. And again, we'll just do function rec res. And what we'll do here is we'll just put the res.send. And again, we'll just say to do, and instead of returning a post with an ID, we'll just go ahead and add a post or modify a post. So this is what we call routing. We're just routing these different types of these different routes for the client to actually access the handlers, which is our logic, our business logic of how we want to handle requests. I believe I have one more, get, put, and...
Post, delete?
Delete, yeah. We don't need to do post.
Yeah, so what Steven's doing is he's basically creating a fully RESTful API that allows you to do all the standard CRUD operations like create, read, update, and delete. I mean, obviously he's not doing every single one, but by creating an API like this, it basically gives you all the methods that you might need to access for modifying an object conceivably from any other structure or method. So for instance, the ID thing. I mean, now that he's created something for every single post, once that post, that ID could presumably be for every single post, right? So every single post can have their actual unique endpoint where you could get the contents of that particular post and you could change it or delete it or whatever else.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so so we started up our service, so let's test our new APIs just so that we can make sure that those worked as well. So I post and I could say 1, 2, 3, 4. So I want to get a post with ID 1, 2, 2, 3, 4. If I send, I'll get a response saying return post with ID 1, 2, 2, 3, 4. So it's exactly what I passed here. You can tell it's being parsed. If I do a post, I should expect a 404 not found because this route is not specified, which is great, 404 not found. And then finally, we'll do a put just to say, I'll do the put and the delete. Let's see, modify post and delete, which will hit the delete route. Delete post with ID 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4. So, so we've created our basic post routes. Now let's do something more interesting, which is every application needs authentication. Almost every app does. Like we want to know who are the people that are using our application. So to do that, what we'll do is we'll use npm, which is very similar, like I mentioned before, it's like pip or NuGet, which really just allows us to install packages that are useful for us to do implementations like authentication. So to actually use it, one thing that's really useful here is if you go to npmjs.org, and you can just search for any package that you want, and I'm going to go to Passport. And this is what we're going to use. We're going to use Passport, which is really just a simple authentication library for Node.js. And every one of these guys starts with how to install, which is really, if it's not a CLI, it's pretty much installed locally, which means npm install Passport, we'll install that locally right here. So to do that, we'll go ahead and go into, kill that, npm install Passport. Now, one thing that those installs don't say, which as a Node developer, it took me a few months to realize, is that you can just do --save, and what this will do is actually save that the dependency of this package in the package.json, so that next time you have to run this app, all you have to do is just do npm install, and it'll actually install all those dependencies for you, rather than having to reinstall and say npm install for each one again. Okay, so we did that. We also need to install Passport local, which we'll talk about in a bit, but basically Passport local is required to do local authentication. Local authentication, I mean not Facebook, not Twitter, not Microsoft account, not Google, just your own local authentication schema. And that's what we'll be using right here. So we'll do Passport local save, and then we need one more, which is since we're actually making our own users and storing those in our own database, we don't, it's never a good idea to store passwords. So we're going to just store password hashes. And then to do that, there's a great library called bcrypt. And again, if you want to get like the documentation for any of these libraries, or if you want to make your own library, you just go to npmjs.org. I generally just go npmjs.org, whack packages, and then the module name. And that'll just give you what the module name is, or what the README or the documentation for a module is. So we'll use bcrypt-node.js. And that will give us a really easy API to use so we could create password hashes. All right, so now I have everything installed. I'm going to go back to app.js, and I need to require a few things. Usually when you install a package, you need to require, like, you need to import those packages. So I'm going to grab passport, require, passport, OK. And then I'm going to do, I don't need to actually grab bcrypt here. We don't need it. And there's one more thing, actually, that we do need to grab, which is Express doesn't really come with much. It has, when Express 4 came out, they debundled a lot of stuff. So we actually have to install the cookie parser or the session manager as well. So npm install express-session, and we'll save that too. And we'll require that as just a module called session equals require express-session here. And then if I go to, I'm going to put it right below the logger. I'll just do app.use. So we'll talk about middleware in a bit. So middleware sits between your app, between your request and your application. And app.use is really just a way that we add middlewares to it. I don't want to get too much into it, but basically it stands between the client making the request and the logic that handles the routing control. So you could do some common functionality like parsing cookies, or what we'll actually use it for ourselves to create our own middleware is to enforce API authentication. So right now I'm just going to create, I'm just going to use session to as a middleware. And I think it's like this. I'll double check. I think session, and then there's a secret here, and pick whatever secret string you want. This is just used for creating the session hashes. And then, so now that I've added the session middleware, the only other thing I have to do is actually have to add the passport middleware, and I'll add it at the bottom. I won't get into it, but middleware a lot of times matters in the order that you use it. So we have to use passport.initialize, I believe. I'm gonna have to double check.
Yeah, passport.initialize.
Okay, so, and then afterwards, app.use passport.session. Mm-hmm. So if I did this in reverse, passport.session would just choke, because you need to initialize. You need to pass the initialization middleware first, and then afterwards the session. Yeah. Okay. Ooh, that was a lot.
Yeah. And just one more point on the middleware. I mean, it's not that difficult. Basically, the order that you're defining that middleware in the app.js, that's the order that they're going to be run in. So, the first one is going to check for something, and then it'll just go next and next and next, whatever middleware that applies to the route that you're looking at.
Okay. Cool. So now we're going to actually add authentication. We're going to use the passport library, which we just added. We're going to implement sign up, login, and logout routes. And instead of storing users to MongoDB, for now we'll just use in-memory so that we don't have to talk about Mongo until the next session. So I talked about testing the APIs, and we're going to create mini routes, mini routers that we've already done. But we're going to use this same model, this same routing model over our authentication piece. Okay, so let me jump back down. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file here called passport.init.js. So this is just a clean way. This is actually Hone's idea of basically cleaning up our passport implementation, because passport can be, although it's simple, it's a lot just to take in. And essentially, Passport has like its own sort of like middleware. They call it strategies. And in order to actually do it, we're going to just copy some boilerplate code to bootstrap our Passport implementation. So I'm going to copy it, and I'll explain what each piece does. It doesn't actually work, so don't be too fret about having magic code. We're going to go in and implement it. But I need to copy some basic stuff because it's really specific to the library. Okay, so Passport has strategies, and like I mentioned before, we have to do npm install Passport local, which means that we're going to grab that local strategy. We're going to grab bcrypt, which is our cryptology framework or library, which will just create hashes for our passwords, so we don't have to store the user passwords directly. And we're going to have this temporary users data store, which is really just a JavaScript object where we'll save our users, and then in the future we'll replace that with MongoDB. So the first thing we'll do is we'll implement the signup API, which the signup API is pretty simple. What we're going to do is you get called, we register this as a signup strategy, and it'll be local strategy, and this little thing just says, hey, pass the whole express request to our callback here, and this is our callback. The callback has a request, which is the request coming in from from Express, the username, the password, and done. So Passport actually automatically parses out the username and password from a form body when you do the REST request. So we can just assume that it has it. And what we'll do is we'll do users and username. So we'll grab the username that we have here. And if you're familiar with JavaScript, if you just pick the at username, it's just going to be a key value store. So what we'll do is we'll create a new object. Before I do that, though, what we want to do is go and check if the user already exists. So we don't have more than one user with the same name. So let's say if users username, meaning that if I got anything besides 0 or null, we can just return done with an error saying username already taken, because we're trying to sign up with the same username if you hit this path. And we will do a we'll do false, which will just basically say, hey, we did not sign in, and here's your error. Otherwise, we'll create a add user to DB, and in our case, we will just be storing it locally. So we're not actually using real DB. This is all in memory. And we'll say username is equal to the username that was passed in as a parameter. And the password will be, so if you look actually down here, we have invalid password and create hash. These are some helper functions that we pre-wrote, which uses bcrypt's APIs to create cryptographic hashes. So instead of storing the password directly, which is very bad, you don't want to do that, instead we'll do create hash, and we'll just simply store the hash. And later what we can do is when someone tries to log in, we'll just compare the hash with the password and see if the computed hash matches the one that we stored. So password, and what will happen is it'll just return the hash, and we'll store it back in the password. Finally, instead of having a object here, so in Node.js, it's really traditional when you call an API, your first, or when you call a callback, your first parameter is usually an error. So if it's null, that means that you don't have an error. If it's not null, that means you do. And the other parameters are usually just specific to that actual API or that function. So we'll say users username is what we'll pass. So we'll say we'll pass back the entire object, the user's object that we just created. Okay, so that's our sign-up implementation. Now we have to do our login implementation. So again, these are like weird little middlewares, but essentially when we hook this up to our API, our authentication API, because Passport kind of sits between our users and our clients and our actual route handler, it'll detect that we tried to do an authentication because we're going to have specific authentication APIs. And Passport will, these functions really instruct Passport how to save users, how to hash the passwords, and how to provide a user back to Passport. All Passport's really doing is just kind of serializing, storing those users into a session, into a HTTP session, and then storing out. So if you ever use a website that like, hey, your session expired or whatever, that means that's the same exact thing. We're actually just storing you in like a little cache you could think of on the server, and you get a cookie, and it tells what user you are after you've logged in. Okay, so Passport use login. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to say if the user at username, so we're going to get the username from the request. If the user at username does not exist, then we just need to return done user not found. So you can put whatever verbose error you want. Otherwise, we'll put, and we'll say false, you did not log in. Did I put true on the last one I did? Yeah, okay. If it's not false, then it's considered a successful login. Okay, and then, so the user is not found, and then we also need to check if the password is valid. So we can say is valid password. Is valid password takes a user object that we've just stored, and the password that that the person who's saying that they're that user provided. So if I try to sign in as someone, that's the password I'll get. So we'll pass users, and I believe users here, username, and password that we were given from the API here. And if the password is valid, which means we, or if it's not valid, because instead of nesting, you could just do not, return done invalid password. And we'll also say false. Otherwise, we actually got the user and we did successfully signed in. So, and I could even console log that to make sure that we get that debug output. It's a whole lot of code I'm writing without running, so kind of makes me nervous, but we'll see. Okay, and we'll just pass null here to say that we did not have an error, and instead of false, we'll pass in the user and username. Cool. So all this is actually in the Passport documentation. This is not made up or whatever. It's actually in there. And then finally, we have to just, when Passport is called, or when Passport wants to serialize a user into a session or deserialize, it needs a unique identifier for that user. So in the next section, we'll use the MongoDB IDs that we have. In this section, since we know that users will have unique usernames, we could just use the username for the user object. So kind of a key value type of thing, where the username will serve as a key.
Could you go back to your code real quick?
Yeah.
How do you check? So, okay. So if the password is valid, then so the first thing we'll check for users' existence.
Yep.
The second is going to check for if the password is
Yep.
not valid, and then the third you're going to check for, and if both of those are true, then you're
Yep.
already going to just go and sign in.
Yep.
Is that
And
right?
yep. So let me put some comments here. So check if password is correct, and otherwise, if the user exists and the password is correct, then you should be able to sign in, right?
Okay.
And so now, if we're past the, when Passport wants to serialize the user object into the session, we need to provide it what that key should be. So we're just gonna, actually this is pre-baked in for us, so we're just gonna pass back to the done, no error, you're gonna get the user ID back, or the username back, and Passport will use that. Now when Passport comes back and says, hey, I wanna get a user out of the, if a user comes back that's already logged in, we want to be able to get that out of the session. So instead of we have not implemented this, we'll say no, we have, and instead we'll do users, which is our database, our faux database, and we'll say username. And that'll return the user object back. Object back, and I'll put here, tell Passport which ID to use for user. Okay. So now we have that part. And finally, we can actually start implementing our API. And I'm not going to torture everybody through this again with the gets and the posts and whatever. I have some pre-baked code that will just define all of the APIs that we need for authentication. And we could get right down to testing to see if it works. Okay. So if I go back to our GitHub repository, and so I did the sign up, I did the login, the serialization, so the whole Passport init. Finally, we can do the, this is initialized Passport. We'll do that in a second. I want the APIs. Actually, let me go ahead and do this now so that we can initialize Passport in app.js. So we know that we created a Passport init.js, but we never actually used it or imported it. So we'll go ahead and do that. And I'm going to do it after the Passport initialize and Passport session middlewares. And what this will do is we'll just call the object, it'll just require the file that we just made. And if you notice, we have this weird thing called module.exports. Module.exports in Node really just means that I have a Node module that I want to present. Module is the base, it's a global object within that file. And what we can do is anything that we put on the exports object is what will be exposed when you require this thing. So you can think of it as public. And JavaScript is great because it allows us to do crazy things. So exports is actually just going to be a function within itself. And that allows us to actually call the module with the function and initialize the module. And what we'll do is we'll pass that module, the passport module, and it'll go ahead and initialize the passport library, and then we'll be good for the whole application. Okay, so let's see here. That's a whole lot of mouthful. So because we required init passport is, remember, it's a function that's been exported by the init passport init file, and we'll call init passport with the passport module that we required here. Okay. Finally, we're going to implement our authentication API. And I believe I have another slide, and I think they're going to kill me if I don't start breaking some stuff up. So we will have, it's under adding authentication, but it's really the same thing. They're really going to kill me because I didn't separate anything out. And so really what we're going to do is we're just going to add the APIs that we need around the passport library that we just implemented, and we'll go ahead and test those out. All right, so to do that, like I mentioned before, I have I'm pre-baking some code here, kind of like a cooking show. It's already coming out of the oven. Okay, so we have a similar idea. It's a little bit different than our previous implementation to where we just exposed the router object as the export. This time around, we're actually exporting a function as the export, which just allows us to pass the passport module around without having to like re-require it or things like that. So, and it avoids having to use globals and stuff, and it's quite nice. So this will actually be the function, and instead of exporting the whole thing as a router, it'll just return a router, which also works because the express use function for routers expects to have a router object back, which will be compliant. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create, let me start with these first. These are pretty self-explanatory. We'll have the signup API. So this will actually mount it at auth signup, passport authenticate. And what this will do is we'll call the authenticate strategy of signup, which we defined in that passport init file, and it'll either redirect the client to the authentication success API or the auth failure API. In this case, since they're static strings, we can't just say success and failure. We have to say auth/success and auth/failure. Otherwise, it'll route to the wrong API. We're going to do a similar thing here. We're going to call the login strategy with the login API. And these will redirect to these little, kind of like little dummy routes here, which will send us the same exact thing, no matter what you send it. So really it'll say, hey, success, and it'll be rec.user. The reason why we can do rec.user is because that user is saved into the session, and automatically middleware just makes it magically happen to where the user will be deserialized out of that session. Same thing with failure. Failure will just respond back to say, hey, the authentication failed. And what we'll just do, we're not going to get too fancy. We'll just assume that the user put the wrong username or password. And that's what the client will use to display the error message. OK. Finally, I think I need to comment out the authenticate require, so we can actually pull the authentication file. And then we have to also uncomment the registration of that router to the auth endpoint. So remember that anything in the authentication router will start at auth/signin, auth/logout, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so Helen, are you ready to see this run?
I'm very hopeful.
That did not sound confident. Of course I didn't have a syntax error or anything, right? I mean, so. There's
actually a couple of people in the chat window with some syntax suggestions.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't work, I'll go through it and tell you why people think that is so.
Okay, so it looks like...
yeah, it looks good so far.
Most of it, I mean, the stuff that was executed, right? So let's see if we, just make sure I don't crash or anything like that. So we're going to grab our REST tester again. Oh, geez, where is it? There it is. And what we'll do is we'll do auth, sign up, and it'll be a post. And instead of JSON, we're going to pass form data. So username will be Edward, password, super duper secret. And we'll do X, yep, form encoded, we'll send. Oh no, has no method authenticate. Okay, so this is for incoming method has no message authenticate, which is, it looks like I'm doing rec.authenticate somewhere. I love when stuff doesn't work exactly right. I think it's where am I calling rec.authenticate?
Well, you're calling authenticate. So Steven's calling authenticate in the authenticate.js. There are a couple people who think that the issue might be in the passport init.
Yeah, it probably is. Let me look at the stack trace real quick. Start routes. Oh, geez, this thing is. Okay, there we go. Oh, there we go. Okay, so authenticate.js. Look, everybody's paying attention. Okay, authenticate.js line 17. And it starts from there, right? So line 17, it does the post, which is great. This is what we expect, which is awesome because we're kind of teaching debugging right now too, right? And let's see, it's router, express, middleware, blah, blah, blah. Is passport init on this stack trace? Let's see.
I don't believe so.
Not. Okay.
But I think you're also applying the passport init stuff to passport. So now it should be on passport.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Where did I screw it up here?
You missed an S at the end of users, someone said. Well, it won't. Can you search for user and then the square bracket?
Yeah. There we go. Cool. Nice catch, but I don't think that was the error.
No.
There's a thing that's saying, hey, it doesn't have authenticate, which means that this would mean that the incoming message has no method authenticate, which means that I'm calling rec, because rec is the incoming message, and authenticate means I'm calling authenticate on that. Which would mean it's authenticate.js line 17, which is where we'd expect it.
Let's go back to app.js.
Oh, yeah, after this, because it's probably the middleware. That's what I'm thinking.
So where did we we did initialize passport.
Yeah, we
and
did.
Are we? And then we're doing the authenticate. And so passport should have the authenticate piece.
Yeah, it should have it there. Because we did session afterwards, and we did initialize after the passport init. And do we require passport? We did.
Did we require passport local?
Oh, yeah, we did. But we need to require it and passport init, which is passport local. That's interesting. What we can do is, because it's kind of complaining about, it's really complaining about the app.js setup. Like, I think that's what it's really complaining about. I can just fall back to the pre-baked stuff if I can't figure this out in the next minute. Initialize, let me go fall back to README. Passport init, app.js, somewhere here. Here, okay, so here's our passport initialize, passport session, keyboard cat as our secret, whatever that is. And we require passport, which should be the same as here. I don't think I misspelled anything. Authenticate, well, this is fine. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab the finished part of the module so we can see what we might have missed. Oh, I think that's what it is.
Oh, yeah.
There we go. All right. I'm sure everybody enjoys me sweating. Okay. So the reason why is because authenticate remember, is exported as a module, which expects a function with a parameter. And because this is null, it's going to say, hey, this thing doesn't really exist. So we do need to pass that over to it, which is passport. Anybody catch that in the chat?
Yeah, I can't tell if the person said it right when we said it or what, but we seem to have found it around the same time.
All right, let's try it again. Beautiful. OK. So now we have our password and my hash for the password. So notice that the password is actually not saved. OK. And get doesn't really do anything. If you do now we can do login since I've already signed up. So I can actually log in with the same thing. And actually, let's go ahead and do the log out. So log out a post or is it a get?
It is a...
Log out's a get. Sign out. So sign out. And the cool part is that Passport adds these really nice, what is it, get, auth, sign out. Is that correct?
Yeah.
It's saying not found. Why?
Well, I mean, if it's not in the...
So? Oh, that's fine. Yeah, 302. 302 redirect, right? And because it's redirecting to the root, we don't actually have a thing for that, so that's fine. So we get a 302 redirect, which means we did log out. When we do the application, that'll just mean that it'll redirect the user to the view. And if we do auth, again, log in, we should be able to log in with user super duper secret, which we do. And auth success is what you're turned to, and we still have the same username and password. So everything's working fine. We have our login. Now, finally, we talked about middleware. We talked about all these magic functions that put stuff in between stuff. But now we're going to write our own middleware. And middleware is really useful if you want to do something, some type of action to a subset of APIs or subset of routes, or all your routes. We have application level middleware, which is what we use, app.use, app.use, app.use. All that is application level middleware, which means that any router, it applies to any router, any route, all of them. So it's kind of global. What we want to do is, since we want to use the authentication piece for our API specifically, we just want to lock in, we want to lock up our app APIs. So our post APIs. So to do that, it's actually really simple. What we'll do is we'll say router.use function. Now, when you write middleware, middleware is super easy. All it is really, at its most basic form, is a function that has access to the request object, the response object, and the next object. Next means I'm going to call the next middleware in line between me and the request handler, which means that the order of those middlewares actually mattered, because if middleware did something before and you weren't expecting that, then you might ruin the other middleware after it, or vice versa. So let's do this. And remember, I didn't mention it, but the log out authentication API has this cool middleware because Passport adds it. Rec.logout is not something that comes with Express. It actually comes with Passport, and it allows you to just do this logout thing. So let's see here. If we do if, I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to do this very quickly. If rec.is, I forgot if it's is logged in or what it is. Let me see really quick.
I think you made it is authenticated.
Yeah, but the rec function actually has is authenticated. There we go. So rec has middleware is authenticated, and what we can do is we can just ask, hey, are you authenticated? And is that a function? Yeah. If it's not authenticated, what we'll just say is, hey, res.send message. Actually, we'll just do redirect to, and Helen will make this page eventually, but we'll do hash login. And so now this will lock up any API that is on this route altogether. And really, that's fine for this router, except we want to be able to allow those posts to be public and anybody to access those. So if we want to do that, we need to make the get for that completely open and excluded from the authentication. But every other method should, modification methods and new methods and such like that, those should require authentication, and the user, any random user or any unauthenticated user shouldn't be able to access those. So what we'll have is if rec.method is equivalent to get we'll just go ahead and do next, and we'll return.
So what Steven's doing is he's basically organizing this API so that the GET request can be accessed by any user, logged in or not. But for all the other routes, you have to be actually a logged in, authenticated user to be able to, for instance, post or delete a post or whatever else.
Okay. Here, return res.redirect, user not authenticated, redirect to login page. Okay, and I believe that's all we want to do. And so this will actually enforce that. So now if I restart the server, we'll do this test very, very quickly so I could get, so we could go on our break. So I've started it up, and now I'll go back to the REST tester. And I know it's not exactly sexy, but this all matters, because if you could test this without using the app, it'll save you a lot of time. So first thing we'll do is we'll do a sign up. Remember, since this is in memory, when we restart the server, we lose everything, which is why the database is important. So we'll sign up. Great, we signed up. We're authenticated now. And now if we go to API, oh shoot, you know what I should have done? Let me do the negative test. So we'll negative test it, and we'll just try to do a post with a new post on the post endpoint. And what we'll do is we get redirected to the login page. However, if I do a post, so we could tell that part works. So the middleware is working there. Now if we go to auth, let me make this a little bigger. There we go. Sign up. We're going to do a post again, and we'll sign up. Great, I'm authenticated. Now I can go and create a post. So API post, and if I send, did I get it? Okay. Looks like it's holding. I might have done something here. If it's not authenticated, yeah. If it's not otherwise, res.next, or return next. User authenticated, continue to next middleware or handler. Okay, that was my mistake. Really quickly, let me redo that one more time. So what we can see is that if I do sign up, so auth, sign up, I'll do a post. We've logged in, we've authenticated, and now if I do API post, and I do a post to that, which is an authenticated only API, we'll get a response to do create new post. Awesome. So in our next module, what we'll do is we'll grab MongoDB, and we'll actually implement those implementations for the to-dos of whether or not we need to create a new post and store that in database, retrieve a new post, send all the posts back down to the client right from the database itself. And what we've done in this module is we've created all the routes that we need for the AngularJS front end, and we've also implemented the authentication that we need to protect certain APIs from unauthenticated users. Anything else, Helen?
No, I think that's it. So we're going to go for a meal break, and we're going to be back in an hour or so.
Yep. All right, we'll see you guys soon.
Yeah, see you.